Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, the online book launch of Beryl, The Making of a Disability Activist by Dustin Galer. My name is Sarah, and I'm a staff at Between the Lines, the publishers of this new exciting book. We're so pleased to be hosting tonight's event with Dustin and this impressive panel of speakers tonight. In a short moment, I will introduce our panel for the evening. But just to tell you a little bit about our small, modest book press, Between the Lines is a Canadian social movement press founded in 1977. Our publishing house is situated in Takaranto, traditional Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory, subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This land was stewarded by the Mississauga of the Credit River and is home to many Indigenous peoples, including the Métis and those displaced from their homelands by Canadian extractive and other industries. We welcome everyone joining tonight to reflect upon the lands in which you live and work, and we encourage you to work in solidarity with Indigenous social movements. Between the Lines is a proudly left-wing book press, and the books we publish reflect our activist roots and our commitment to social justice struggles. We are collectively run, and we publish books without bosses. That's our tagline, through a horizontally organized staff collective and editorial committee. We want to extend a huge congratulations to Dustin for writing this important book. We are proud to be its publishers. If you'd like to pick up a copy of Beryl, you can order it from your local bookstore, or you can go to our website to order one from us online. We also have it available as an accessibly formatted ebook. I can drop a link in the, oh yeah, there we go. We dropped a link in the chat, and you can read more about Beryl and our other books at btlbooks.com. Tonight's event should run about 60 minutes. And audience members are encouraged to engage, ask questions, share your comments. You can type it into the chat function in the corner of your browser. You can also use the Q&A function to ask questions. All right, and now just to introduce our speakers. Dustin Galer is the author of Beryl, The Making of a Disability Activist. He's a professional historian with a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. Judy Rebick is a Canadian writer, journalist, a lifelong activist, and feminist who has also kindly written the foreword to Beryl. Donna Thomson is an author, educator, and speaker on issues relating to family caregiving, disability, and aging. She teaches at McMaster University. Geoffrey Reaume is an associate professor in the Critical Disability Studies graduate program at York University. And last but not least, Michael Gottheil is Canada's first Accessibility Commissioner with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. All right, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much to our panelists. I will hand it over to Dustin now to speak about this exciting book.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to have a brief chat about a super interesting person. I'm so grateful to Between the Lines for giving me the opportunity to share Beryl's story with the world. And I'm very happy by the very positive reception to the book, which I think speaks to this unique charisma that Beryl had in her lifetime and easily translated to the page, actually. I mean, the sad reality, of course, is that so many of the things Beryl fought for 30, 40 plus years ago are just as relevant and pressing today. Especially accessibility and transportation, which happens to be in the news cycle yet again recently, as I think we all know. We were also supposed to have total accessibility by 2025 in Ontario. Maybe they are celebrating in some parallel dimension, but in this reality, I think there is obviously so much more work to do. You know, at the end of her life in the mid-1990s, almost everything Beryl fought for and hoped to achieve was threatened by a new conservative government that introduced a series of devastating cuts that disproportionately affected the disability community and their capacity to advocate for themselves. But even at this late stage of her life, when she's suffering from chronic pain and constantly reading about these endless cuts, Beryl remained hopeful, I think, that the next generation wouldn't repeat the same mistakes in their treatment of people with disabilities. And I think she was able to remain hopeful because she had spent so much of her life by that point, pouring all of her hopes and dreams into the minds of young children who she believed would carry that message of empathy into their adult working lives and various professions. Now, I'm not sure it all played out as she intended, but I do know that she tried her very hardest to change the status quo for herself and millions of others like her. One where there were adequate rights and opportunities in all things from accessible housing and transportation to employment and social assistance. Beryl wasn't perfect. None of us are. She didn't always play well with others. She could be prickly and demanding. She sometimes burned bridges that maybe could have been left standing. But personally, I think that just makes her more interesting and real as a person. And that's why I wanted to make sure that went into the book and not just, as Geoffrey once said, hagiography. I never know how to pronounce that. Obviously, no one could deny her passion and commitment to the disability rights movement, but she would just, barrel down the road and everybody better get out of the way. And, some people told me that that was exactly what was needed at certain points, and she was capable of providing that kind of leadership. Beryl saw such potential in programs and activities that promote awareness of disability issues on a very basic level. She would even use her body as a tool of education to help build bridges with the children and adults that she met. Not everyone agreed with that approach, but even those who disagreed believed that for some people, meeting Beryl and hearing her story could be a potentially transformative experience. And, I really think there was some kind of trickle down effect there that is very powerful but hard to measure. And it's actually one of the reasons that I wrote the book, not just to raise the profile of one person whose story I found particularly interesting. I mean, it even allowed me to discover a long repressed memory of meeting her as a 5-year old when she visited my school. Like, you can't even buy that sort of therapy. Uh, but I also hope to help attract attention to more stories like this because the fact of the matter is that Beryl was just one among many, many people forced to advocate for themselves. And we need to hear their stories, if only as a conduit to presenting complex issues to a wider audience. And I think this is also a moment in history where we're starting to see people getting caught up in their own echo chambers. And so this is a book about reaching beyond those kinds of borders, as Beryl tried to do just one person at a time. So I hope readers will be inspired by what Beryl was able to overcome and accomplish. But then motivated to integrate her message of empathy into their own belief systems and social practices, and maybe vote accordingly and actively participate in building a more inclusive future. And with that, I'm far more interested to hear what others have to say and maybe get into more of a discussion. So I'll turn that back to Sarah.
Great. Oh, it's so nice to hear an author talk about their work. And yeah, it's lovely to hear some of your reflections on Beryl and in the book. Why don't we turn it now to Judy to give some comments?
Okay, well, I knew Beryl. Well, first of all, I want to thank Dustin for writing the book because Beryl is one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. And you might know, I've met a lot of people in my life. And he has paid to her, he has done justice to her life, which is not easy to do because she was, as I say, a really extraordinary person. I met Beryl in the 80s when I was working for the Canadian Hearing Society, and she had this idea to organize a coalition of people with disabilities that would be a coalition of agencies and what we used to call consumer groups, that is, groups of disabled people themselves. This was a very radical idea at the time. Nobody else had ever done it, to push for a stronger employment equity bill. Rosie Abella had written a report about employment equity. She called employment equity. In the States, it was called affirmative action. She did include people with disabilities in her list of people that could be affected, but it wasn't in her bill, in her paper was very good. But the bill that the Mulroney government wrote was not very effective, and we wanted it to be stronger. And so my boss, Dennis Morris, who was really also another amazing person, he appointed me because he knew my activist history to co-chair on behalf of the Canadian Hearing Society. And we built that coalition. And not only did we build that coalition of people with disabilities, we eventually broadened it to racialized people and unions and so on. And Beryl was the originator of that. And so, and also, like I write in the book about her bravery. I mean, she confronted Brian Mulroney twice physically. One time she grabbed his arm and she wouldn't let go until he gave us what she was asking for. Like even I, who am pretty gutsy, would never in a million years do that. But so in that sense, she was able to use her disability in a way, because I mean, what is his security guards going to pull off a person, pull off her hand from the prime minister? And when so the only limb she has, I don't think so, right? So she was even able to use her disability in that kind of way, which was amazing, when you think about it. It was really amazing. I never had any run-ins with her at all, so I was kind of surprised about that in the book. And the other thing is I learned a lot about her that I didn't know, because she didn't talk a lot about herself in the meeting. She was very political, and she did help us to bring in a very broad group of people. So I think that we all have a lot to learn by reading your book, and also it's really a good read. So it's not easy to do that, to capture someone like Beryl, who was such an amazing. I learned lots of things about her I didn't know, and I guess the last thing I want to say is that one of the things which I understand very well now is Beryl represents someone who had a really terrible suffering in her disability because it was due to a number of surgeries. It wasn't something she was born with or one thing that happened. It was one thing after another after another. And instead of being crushed by that, she stood up and fought back. And by fighting back, she healed her soul. That was the message I got in the book. And I think that's such an important message for anyone with a disability, anyone with mental health problems, that the best way to heal is to fight back, and to fight for a better world for people who are suffering like you're suffering. And Beryl is such a great example of that. So thank you. I mean, I wish there were more books like yours, and hopefully there will be.
Oh, great. Thank you, Judy. Why don't we turn now to Donna to give some comments?
Well, I'm just nodding my head to everything that you said, Judy, because and what a privilege that it is that for you that you knew Beryl. This book, I had never heard of Beryl before you got in touch with me, Dustin, and asked me to be an early reader. I read this book in one sitting. I literally could not put it down. I was completely captivated by Beryl, from her early life in Liverpool, England, through her surgeries, her suicide attempts. This is a riveting story, and one that is, I've just been thinking so much that she is a person of her time. And she reminds me a lot of my own mother, who died in 2018 at 96, who was, sort of cut from the same cloth. I guess, I find myself wondering, how on earth can our society today produce a barrel cook? How can we, how what are the circumstances of her life? And what you said, Judy, it reminds me of just a sentence that I read in the book, which is confronted with roadblock after roadblock in her journey toward recovery. Beryl dug deep within herself, summoning a reserve of willpower that is often only available to those who have survived prior hardship. And I think, like, I was asking myself before this book launch this evening, what was Beryl's superpower? What did it have to do with the times in which she lived? What did it have to do with her family? I'm very, very interested in family. So, of course, I was completely amazed that Dennis, her son with a developmental disability, was her primary caregiver. There's a huge family story there, but that together in the environment of having lived through the Second World War, through poverty, through physical, emotional, and spiritual pain, she emerged as this powerhouse. And as a convener, as an activist who was able to bring together a big tent of for change. And, as somebody who wouldn't let go of the prime minister's arm, where did she get that? The gutsy courage that she had. She was completely indomitable. I don't know what the word is. You could not put her down. And we desperately need somebody like that in the disability movement today. And I wonder what we do in the current times of growing populism, of consumerism, of individualism. How do we produce a barrel that we need so badly today? So I hope that we'll be able to have some discussions about that. It was a wonderful book. Thank you for writing it, Dustin.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah.
Oh, such great questions and comments. I'm sure we can have a discussion after everyone's spoken. Geoffrey, would you like to say a few words now?
Sure, thank you, and congratulations to Dustin on writing and researching such an amazing first-rate biography of Beryl Potter. I'd never met Beryl Potter. I heard of her in the 80s and 90s, but I didn't know her. So it was delightful to read this book and to read about the history of the period in which she lived as well, from her early childhood until she died in 1998. And Dustin, your book does a wonderful job of showing how Beryl Potter was transformed by her life circumstances from a shy, able-bodied person to an outspoken disability activist. And the way in which this transformation came about is very clearly shown through the various barriers she encountered and experienced in her life, and the way she tried to address them, both as a disabled person and as a disabled woman in particular. And shows each some of you have mentioned also about how compelling the book is. There's 32 very concise chapters. 32 chapters sounds like a lot, but it actually makes it so compelling to read. It's a great, it's like these fantastic snapshots, 32 and all put together, produce an amazingly well-written book. And so Dustin's done a great job also of showing the historical context in which Beryl Potter lived. This includes her personal struggles with the prejudices that she experienced as a disabled person, and how she sought to change these prejudices in different ways, as well as her advocacy based on her own life experiences, and in particular about how the documents reveal so much about her personal life and how the personal became political through the well-known disability slogan, "Nothing about us without us." I particularly like how the book just documents the history of the disability rights movement in late 20th century Ontario through the life of a very well-known disability activist based in Toronto, and in particular how the changing attitudes towards bodily and mental difference, about which Beryl contributed significantly in her own way, was so very much influenced by the wider disability movement as well, and how she also was involved in the disability movement, but also at times was involved outside the disability movement, but continued to be an activist. And it's especially important that while taking a positive view of Beryl Potter's life and her contribution, as Dustin alluded to in his talk, Dustin has not written a hero worshiping account, but shows her as a real human. She made mistakes. Some people found her hard to get along with. Others, in other words, she was like most other people, in many different ways in that sense. Also, it's important that you talked, Dustin, about Beryl Potter's experience as an activist from within the disability community and the tensions that happened as a result of that. So it's also very important to note how that's not a unique experience, that there are many activists who've also had tensions within the disability community at different time. And so it shows what a personally invested form of activism like Beryl's, how it could take a toll on personal friendships and allyships in different ways. And also her relationship with Dennis, her son, which Donna has mentioned, I thought was particularly poignantly discussed, given at times their difficult relationship with each other, and yet they remain close to the day she died, and also very important to emphasize how in their relationship they worked in their life together so very well as caregivers and of each other, including Dennis, who is a person with intellectual disability, which is very important to stress as a caregiver for his mother, because of course one of the common prejudices towards people with intellectual disabilities is they can't be caregivers, and he certainly was, even if their relationship at time was quite fraught, as it is in many caregiver situations. So in this regard, I found the main strength of the book relates to first person accounts throughout, whether it's family, friends, or political activists. Beryl's voice and the voice of people who knew her comes through loud and clear, making this a sort of as it happened biography. And I'm particularly like how you include Beryl's quote, "I'm going bit by bit," which says a lot about her years-long experience of acquiring disability, and also the extension of how that led to her activism. So it's a first-rate read because it's written in such a compelling manner with such compelling evidence and documents that you used and interviews that you used in your research. So well done, Dustin. And I'm looking forward to reading your next book on Canadian disability history. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Geoffrey. Why don't we turn now to Michael, and you can give some comments if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Dustin, for this great book. Now, I didn't know Beryl Potter personally, and I when I picked up the book and read it, I thought, well, am I sure I don't know her? Because, I was going into law school in Toronto, forming my own commitments to social justice and activism during the 80s. And I read the book, and there's a number of people in there that I did know and do know. But nonetheless, when I read the book and the way it was written, it reminded me a couple of years ago. I was living in Alberta, and I went to a performance by this brother and sister artistic team, Jacqueline and Hunter Cardinal, Cree members of the Cree Nation. And Hunter was talking about the Cree definition of infinity, and he called it all the stories yet to be told. And that's always felt so good to me and powerful. And when I picked up this book, this is one of those stories that had to be told. within it, setting, it's a real story, but, it's inspiring. There's hope, there's complexity, there's pain, there's everything human. And in the same way, I think there's so many dimensions to this book and Beryl's story, within sort of the disability studies or disability justice movement. Whether you're interested in history, of course, there's Daryl's activism was right at that transformative time when people with disabilities were emerging from sanatoriums and hospitals and institutions, the deinstitutionalization movement, community living. She was right there and part of living it, but also making it happen from a economic point of view. We talk about people with disabilities being economically insecure housing. Daryl experienced that, and even with, in some ways, she was lucky because she had economic security to some extent through workers' compensation, and yet she had to declare bankruptcy at one point, and certainly she wasn't living well. So another sort of feature of the real life of people with disabilities culturally, of course, she was found herself as a woman in the 1980s, found herself as a single mother, having to raise her kids, and one child with a disability. She had a disability. These are real life experiences for many, many people with disabilities. And of course, she was involved in the political movement at the time, as Judy talked about in the book described. So there's so many dimensions to her life. If you're interested, if one is interested, as I think we all should be, in the development of the disability movement. One other thing that I think certainly was relevant then, Dustin, I know you said some people didn't necessarily agree with her tactics and being out there as a person with a disability, showing off her body. And that's something that's, still, I think it's, she was really a progenitor, because that concept of people with disability occupying their bodies and not hiding themselves away, not covering themselves up, and not being ashamed of how our bodies look. And being, what I sometimes call occupying disability, as opposed to wishing for inclusion, just standing our ground and being there as we are. That's something that Beryl was doing 40 years ago, which is just remarkable. And it's something that people in the disability movement are just, really pushing and talking about at this moment in time. And so it helps us sort of interrogate, the whole concept of inclusion and where people with disabilities sit within that concept and what they may have to offer in terms of, defining a new society. So again, inspiring, just a wonderful book. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Yes, thank you, Michael, for those comments. Dustin, would you like to have a few minutes to say some responses or some thoughts coming out of the comments? And then we can see if there's any other questions from the audience, or if the panelists have anything else that they have thought of in the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd love to share a few things. I wish readers would take away from the book. I mean, people are going to take away what they're going to take away, but I mean, one of the major things, and actually one of the major reasons I wrote the book was that I feel that we really need to know more disability activists and how they've shaped our history. Because I think for most Canadians, name recognition kind of starts and ends with Terry Fox or Rick Hansen, maybe more contemporary like Michael J. Fox. And that's fine, nothing against them. But, you know, I just hope by shedding light, as I said earlier, on this one person's story, we attract more attention to more stories like this. Because I think we're at a moment where, as you know, earlier comments have directed, you know, we're at this moment where we've had enough of these sort of fluffy, inspirational type stories, you know, that frankly help reinforce a lot of negative stereotypes over the years. So I think now is time for something different, and I hope her story fits into that new niche. And another takeaway I hope is that, you know, children really should be exposed to positive representations of disability at a young age, and that's to nurture that empathy instead of fear. So much of our society now is based on fear, and you know, Beryl bet her life's work on children. She spent countless hours crisscrossing the map in her trusty Ford van, which like she purposefully made to look identical to Terry Fox's Van of Hope, because she knew people recognized that van. And she's like, I'm going to capitalize on that for the disability movement. And she engaged with lots of children. You see the pictures, they're all gathered around. And so she did that because, you know, she firmly believed that real lasting change wouldn't happen in her lifetime. And unfortunately, she came to that conclusion fairly early on. Lots of broken promises by policymakers. You know, she felt change would only really happen when we had that new generation of doctors and policymakers, architects, business leaders, you know, they'd be able to carry that message of empathy into their lines of work. And for her, that's how you achieve real change. And when you change people's minds, then they change the way they do things. And quickly, the last takeaway that I hope people will you know, bring from the book is that we really do live in a very death and disability avoidant culture. But by avoiding these topics, we have created systems that are riddled with gaps and other problems. I mean, Beryl spent the latter half of her life simply trying to attract attention to these problems. People usually don't think about disability until it affects them directly. I've experienced that. I mean, many people on the panel maybe do. You know, Beryl knew that as well, because before her accident, she said, you know, she and everyone around her never thought about disability. But, you know, even through all of that, you know, one issue she really worked on was accessible transportation. Ever since paratransit systems were introduced in the 1970s, there have been problems with late and missed pickups and generally inadequate levels of service. You know, it makes it difficult for people to keep, you know, hold a job, keep appointments, you know, actively participate in the community. You know, so change starts by paying attention. And that's what Beryl was really trying to do, attract attention to the gaps in our system so we can have a fulsome evaluation of that. So hopefully people take you know, some of that away. I'm happy to say more, but I'll turn it over to others.
Great. We do have one question in the Q&A, and we have a nice comment as well that I might share. Oh, and we're getting a few more questions. So maybe I'll read these, and then if panelists or Dustin, if anyone would like to jump in, you're more than welcome. So there's a question for Donna, and maybe all the other panelists might have thoughts as well, and inspiration from Beryl's life. How can we plan for caregiving before we have to caregive for family? And we have another question from the audience saying, if she were here today, what would Beryl say about the progress of accessibility? What would she tell us still needs to be done? And we have a nice comment that I'm just going to read as well, because it looks nice. It says, I have just received a copy of the book and I look forward to reading it. I knew Beryl in the 70s and helped her and a few other folks start the Scarborough Rec Club, The organizing idea was learning to support friendships and skill building via a group run by people with disabilities. It was intended to lead to people seeing themselves as citizens, not clients of a system. So those are some comments and questions from the audience, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists if anyone has some reactions or some thoughts they'd like to share.
Well, I'll just respond to the first question, and as it pertains to the comments as well, and to the Scarborough Rec Center. And, I think, as I said earlier, I really was very interested in reading this book from a family perspective. And I think in Canada, right now, we have a new Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence that has started, funded by the Azrieli Family Foundation, which is getting a massive amount of momentum and attention in the country right now, punching way above its weight. And I think that's an organization that started really has its roots in developmental disability and is expanding now to include all ages, all abilities. It's the biggest tent approach that you can possibly imagine. And I would just love to say to Beryl, your superpower is your disability. Like Judy said, nobody would dare take her hand because she's only got one hand. That's her superpower. And she knew that the same truck as Terry Fox had, that gave her power. So we're talking about the kind of influence and convening power that is rooted in vulnerability and in shared humanity that resides in the disability movement. And if you conceive of that as having it as including all families, well, then it's virtually every citizen of the country is implicated by disability by virtue of aging, our aging demographics, and her story that her son with developmental disability was her primary caregiver. I mean, I wonder, how do we prepare as a country made up of families, of chosen families, of birth families, all kinds of families? How do we look after each other? And I think maybe some of the answers to that can be found in not pigeonholing people on the basis of their abilities. I mean, I'm the parent of a 35-year-old young man who has cerebral palsy. He is non-speaking. He has low vision. He has no hand function. He requires 24-hour one-to-one nursing care. And I can name a million ways that he looks after me. So he just does. So I think, it's this coming together, but we need leadership to do this. So sometimes books can help people get an idea of how to lead.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something in relation to that comment about the Scarborough, was it Scarborough Rec thing? Yeah, because when I started working at the Canadian Hearing Society, which was in the early 70s, the idea was, there were all these agencies that got funded that provided services for people with disabilities. They had no deaf people. Like when I came to the Canadian Hearing Society, they had no deaf people on staff. They had no deaf people on the board, right? And they thought they could provide services to the deaf community. Now, I knew that it wasn't any good because I was already a political activist, but there was nothing I could do until Gary Milkowski was hired, who was a deaf, people here probably know, he was also an extraordinary person who was a deaf activist who had become politicized by the struggle at Gallaudet University for a deaf president. And Beryl, by setting up this employment equity committee the way she did, and Dennis by appointing me rather than some bureaucrat to co-chair it, was in fact saying we have to change the whole dynamic between the agencies and the people with disabilities. So for example, one thing we organized was a demonstration on Parliament Hill of people with disabilities. I think it was the first, I don't know if it was the only one, but the first one I know about. And, I said to Dennis, okay, like we got to get buses to get people up there. And he got on the phone and talked to the CNIB who had the buses, right? And nobody from the CNIB came, but all the blind people came, right? So it was the beginning of shifting that paradigm, right? I know more about the deaf stuff because I was involved in that, but it was shifting. And also in the coalition, and this is because she was kind of visionary, Beryl. In the coalition, we all learned about each other. I mean, I knew a lot about deaf people, but I didn't know anything about blind people or intellectually I don't know what the right words are anymore. Sorry. Intellectually, do you say intellectually disabled? I don't know. Anyway, that was the biggest surprise was for me, the advocacy group for people who had been called retarded, and how incredibly gifted they were in so many ways, right? Just what you're saying. So I think that Beryl, in her own way, was a visionary because, coming from her own experience, she understood what needed to happen, and she was very good at making things happen, which is, to me, a great organizer, right? So, yeah. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I might just on that question of if Beryl was alive today, what would she say about the state of accessibility? And I work in the world of accessibility legislation, right? Which the purpose of which is to try to change those systemic barriers, remove the systemic barriers to participation for people with disabilities. And I know what Beryl would say. I think I know what she'd say. She said, not enough, too slow. Let's organize and get government moving. What I don't know if she would say is, that's what I'm saying publicly, but what we need to do is just work tirelessly as a community and not depend on government for change. I mean, obviously you need both, but I would just actually picked up the book this afternoon to reread a few passages that I had bookmarked, and one of them was Dustin, where you talk about after I think it was the failure of 1979, or the government wanting to put in the Handicap Persons Act, or when she wasn't appointed to the Advocacy Council, but she says, okay, well, I'm just giving up on that political side, and she went back to her work with children. And I think many of us at this time, question the efficacy of certainly put all our eggs in the basket of calling on government to this or that. But how much effort we put in that versus just working within our own communities for change. So it'd be interesting to see what I don't know, Dustin, if you have prediction, what she would say about that.
Yeah, I don't. But I do remember this one part of my research was 35 years ago, I think almost like a couple months ago, Beryl Potter, like she appeared on Deanie Petty's City Line. Of course, maybe the styles were a bit different back then, but virtually every topic of their conversation was just as relevant today. It was almost eerie. Like they went through them one at a time: accessibility, transit, affordable housing, poverty, unemployment, discrimination. These things haven't changed over time. And, even going back to my graduate research, it's very difficult as a historian to write the history of something that hasn't changed all that much over time. In fact, it's partly what brought me to biography, so that at least I could chart the course of one woman's life and how that intersected with the evolution of disability rights. But yeah, most of the issues Beryl fought in her day are just as relevant. And I think that she would be pounding on some doors and thinking we should be out there on the streets more, shutting down Young Street like she did, attracting attention. Like, she really knew how to get the media involved. That's actually something Derek Rumble, Bob Rumble's son, for the Rumble Center for the Deaf, said that she was just, she followed his style, boots on the ground. Like, we need to, pull our connections to get the media attention to the issues that we need to, and we really need more of that. And it's very difficult to do that in this very crowded society, media wise. I don't know if I answered anyone's question.
Yeah, if anybody in the audience or any of the panelists have any questions they'd like to share, where we still have some time to discuss. We do have one comment from Mike in the chat. It's a comment more than a question, but I think it's interesting, so I'm gonna just give it a read. Dennis was never talked about or identified as a person with a disability. He was Beryl's son, driver, and support person. One of the things I learned from Dennis was how important supporting caregivers is. Frankly, Beryl used to burn Dennis out, and then Donna was responding, saying that we definitely need to talk about burnout and be careful about understanding the limits of caregivers. So that's another aspect of the conversation that we can think about. But yeah, if anyone...
I think there's plenty of room for oppression in a caregiving relationship, I mean, and again, thinking historically about the society in which Beryl grew up, and being a contemporary of my mother's, my mother said, I don't need any caregivers. I've got you girls, meaning me and my sister. And there was no limit on the number of hours or the number of phone calls every day that she would think nothing of this, because there is a personal nature to family caregiving relationships that has the sum total result of throwing out any kind of rule book about what's fair to people. So I think just as disability rights is, kind of like a 20th century idea, caregiving rights is beginning to be a thing that people are beginning to understand is a reality, particularly because government is taking such a back seat and saying this is a private and personal responsibility to care for each other. So the whole thing after deinstitutionalization, that's all on families. So, I mean, walk the dog, make the lunch, do a tube feed, and do, make sure that you get the dialysis right, because if you don't, somebody's not going to survive. So even to that extent, the burden of care, I mean, I guess my question that I come around to when I reflect on the state of disability and family caregiving today is, should we be advocating to government? Is government does government embody the answers to questions of accessibility, to questions of everything that Beryl was advocating for? Maybe it's a more of a neighborhood thing. I honestly don't know, but I am starting to think that we need to look other places for answers and advocate to other people, other institutions, other groups. I just don't know what the role and the capacity of government is today.
I don't think it's so much role and capacity as it is priorities. The government can always find money for military, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So they can always find money for things they think they need to do. I'm not saying, I think it's true that in my generation, we focus too much on policy and too much on changing government and not enough on community change. So that's why I said the thing of, I think Beryl actually understood both. So one of the purposes of that coalition was for us to educate each other, because we didn't know about each other. We didn't know about our common interests. And then on top of that, when Black people and immigrants and others got involved in the coalition to really share that. It was probably the most powerful thing about the Coalition on Employment Equity was the way in which we learned about each other, what we call now, it was intersectional, right? We didn't have that word back then. But on the other hand, I don't think that as a result of the right-wing pressure on government, neoliberalism and all that, the government's doing less and less to care for the community and to care for us as people and to care for workers, and more, this more and more economic inequality, that we do have to take care of each other, but we also shouldn't let government off the hook, especially, in terms of their responsibility to do that and to support us as citizens, however that might look. So I think it's a combination of both that we need to do. Yeah. And the community stuff's important, both not just in terms of caregiving, but also in terms of educating people, there is a big change. Like I think it's true that the issues are similar, but there's a big change from what it was 40 years ago, from this sort of noblesse oblige idea of agencies that served these poor disabled people who weren't listened to or given any voice. That's changed, I think, I hope. Not with every agency, but maybe Michael could talk about this, but certainly some agency must have learned something in all this time, and the community groups have more agency than they used to. So that's maybe what's changed.
Mhm.
It's such a dilemma because, many years ago, way before my time, pre-industrial age, and in rural communities, people with disabilities lived with their families, and in many cases were involved in the work and the support and integrated into the family and the neighborhood and the community. With industrialization and cities and workers having to have certain abilities, or they were simply tossed aside. Then you had people, then you had the institutionalization, because we had to house people. And so I think you're right, Geoffrey. Like, we can't let government off the hook, because the promise with this deinstitutionalization is that people would live in the community and there would be supports. The money that was spent on institutions would be provided in the community through agencies and so forth. And that hasn't happened. I mean, that we really know that hasn't happened. And so we shouldn't let the government, but I think there's Donna raises an interesting point that, there's an argument to be made, whether it's a conservative government or a progressive government. Government is always going to structure those kinds of support, in some sort of industrial way, right? Because it has to have standards, it has to have processes and bureaucracy to give out the money and so forth. And I think, I don't know what the answer is, but is there something in government itself, that limits, that can never provide the kind of personal type of support and inclusion. that people with disability and their families and the community want.
I just wanted to mention, Michael, it wasn't me who said about the government, it was Judy. So, but
Yeah, I'm often
that's okay.
mistaken for a man. Actually,
Okay,
if
sorry
people
about
just
that.
hear my voice, they assume I'm
Okay.
male.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
It's actually why I was able to get so much. I'm convinced it's why I got so much attention as a woman, is because I sound like a man.
Well, that's interesting. I actually, one thing I wanted to point out about who gets the attention. It's interesting that we've had there so far. There's two historical biographies of disability activists in Canada. Dustin's is the first about a disabled woman, and the first prior to that, a couple of years ago, a book came out by Benjamin Isett and Ravi Malhotra on E.T. Kingsley. And Michael was talking about industrialization involving disabled people. He had, interestingly enough, the only other book is by a man who had lost both his legs due to a train accident. He was a train worker in the US, in Montana, and he lost his legs in the late 19th century. He eventually came to Canada and lived in BC and Vancouver for the last about 25, 30 years of his life, where he died in 1929, I think it was. But anyway, he was a disability activist, and that's something to reflect upon. That I know, Brent, you had put on the comments earlier in the evening about not liking the term disability. And it's interesting when we reflect on and how you prefer to use the word able, differently abled. And it's interesting, we reflect on the changing of terminology. Back when E.T. Kingsley was active 100 years ago, he was active in socialist groups and active in workers groups in BC. The term was handicapped, wasn't it? It was very much, and that term was used, and then many people find it still quite understandably offensive, and the term disability has been used. Other people don't like that term, prefer other terms like Brent Manuel had mentioned about differently abled. And so that's one thing to reflect upon, how these different histories that Beryl Potter experienced and E.T. Kingsley 100 years ago experienced, how that not only the change in priorities, but change even in terminologies of reflecting efforts to change attitudes, which Beryl Potter was very much involved in, wasn't she? By whether it was by going to schools and talking, or the policy actions, or talking about how we describe people with disabilities, and that's something to reflect upon. So I just want to point out that it's interesting. We have two historical biographies by professional historians in Canada, and both are about people who had lost limbs, E.T. Kingsley and Beryl Potter, at opposite
Also about
ends
people who weren't born
with
a disability.
That's right, and born in different countries. Beryl was born in England, and E.T. Kingsley born in the U.S. So, and they came to Canada and made this important, huge contribution in different ways. So, anyway, congratulations again, Dustin.
Okay, well, I'll get on that to help start filling those other gaps there, Geoffrey.
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the book launch, the virtual talk. Maybe Dustin, we can hand it to you to say some final remarks or some final reflections. Yeah, and I think, I will echo what everyone has said. Like, congratulations on writing such an important book on such an important person, filling this gap in history. So it's been really wonderful to hear everyone's insights and reflections on Beryl and on the book. And big congratulations to you. We'll hand it to you to say final thoughts. No pressure or anything, but if you want, anything.
Oh yeah. Well, yes. Well, thank you everyone for just carving out a little piece of time to speak about Beryl. I think we learned a little bit, and also I think I hope people just still read books going forward. That concept of just one reader at a time, and that's what she did. Just one child at a time, one reader at a time. I think that message, it can be powerful. These little micro movements can have this sort of butterfly effect, and I hope that continues. And thank you very much for everything that Between the Lines has allowed for this to happen. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience for joining and for all the comments and questions. Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts and for reading the book and engaging with all of Dustin's work. And yeah, thank you, Dustin, for writing this great book. So have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.